Out of 422 human torpedo pilots deployed during World War II, only 17 survived the war. They had a life expectancy of just 7 minutes once they launched toward their target, but they were described as the most effective and at the same time most suicidal weapon the Axis powers had at sea. But their story is far more horrific than it seems, and now you're going to see why. When people talk about naval warfare in World War II, they usually mention massive battleships or aircraft carriers. But human torpedoes were a different kind of fight altogether. These weapons were essentially modified torpedoes with 2 crew members riding on top, guiding them directly toward enemy ships in what was almost certainly a one-way mission. In 1941, that small piece of underwater technology became one of the most feared weapons in the entire Mediterranean theater. The Italians wanted them because of their desperation. The British Royal Navy had established complete dominance in the Mediterranean, blockading vital shipping lanes and threatening Italy's ability to supply its forces in North Africa. Even worse, the powerful British fleet regularly bombarded Italian coastal positions with seeming impunity. Traditional naval warfare wasn't working. The Italian fleet had suffered devastating losses at Taranto and Cape Matapan. They needed something the British wouldn't expect. The British, of course, knew their naval advantage was crucial. They had no illusions about the importance of Mediterranean control, and they fully expected to maintain it. But instead of preparing for unconventional attacks beneath the waves, they focused on traditional surface and air threats. They studied their previous victories and learned that the Italians couldn't match them in conventional naval combat. So when the Italians went underwater, they found a vulnerability. Italian naval engineer Teseo Tesei was in charge of developing the weapon. He was a brilliant officer who understood the situation perfectly. He knew riding these devices was nearly suicidal. He didn't even expect most operators to survive. But his goal was to strike at the heart of British naval power and disrupt their dominance in the Mediterranean. He figured that even a few successful attacks could change the strategic balance of power in the region. British intelligence estimated no more than a dozen of these weapons existed. However, they underestimated that number significantly. And to make matters worse, they had no effective countermeasures against them. To understand why using a human torpedo was such a nightmare, we need to take a look at how it actually worked. The Italian maiale, or pig, as the operators themselves nicknamed it, was essentially a modified torpedo about 22 feet long with an electric motor. The warhead was detachable, about 660 pounds of explosives that could be planted directly on the hull of an enemy ship. 2 men operated it, a pilot and a navigator, both wearing diving gear while straddling the torpedo like a motorcycle. But here's the thing. Your effective operational range was only about 5 miles at a speed of just 3 knots, walking pace. That meant hours of freezing underwater travel to reach your target. The batteries gave you only about 6 hours of operation in total. That meant if anything went wrong, if you got lost or had to abort, you probably wouldn't make it back. You had to somehow approach a heavily guarded harbor, navigate past nets, mines, and underwater defenses, then locate your target in near-zero visibility conditions. Now, once the whole harbor saw your bright oxygen bubbles on the surface or heard your electric motor, the British defenders knew exactly what to do. Drop depth charges all around the harbor to kill anyone underwater. So, the second they spotted you, your chances of survival dropped from slim to virtually none. The diving equipment itself wasn't bulletproof either. Early versions provided only 4 hours of oxygen. The water temperature in winter operations could cause hypothermia within minutes if your suit leaked. And with 70 pounds of gear strapped to your body while riding a torpedo, it was everything but an easy job to do. Being captured alive was perhaps a bigger fear than drowning or being blown apart by depth charges. Because of the nature of their attacks, striking ships in harbor rather than in open combat, human torpedo operators weren't treated like regular prisoners of war. They were often considered saboteurs or spies, which meant summary execution was a distinct possibility. There's one story from Alexandria when a human torpedo piloted by Lieutenant Luigi Duran de la Penne malfunctioned as he approached the British battleship HMS Valiant. With his oxygen running low and the torpedo stuck at 40 feet depth, he and his partner had to manually drag the 660-pound warhead the final distance underwater. Completely exhausted, de la Penne surfaced beside the target ship and was immediately captured. The British interrogated him, demanding to know where he had placed the explosives. When he refused to tell them, they locked him in a compartment on the lower deck of the very ship he had just mined. As the time of detonation approached, de la Penne finally warned the British captain about the impending explosion, allowing the crew to evacuate that section. Minutes later, a massive explosion rocked the battleship, sending it crashing to the harbor bottom, though it didn't sink completely as the water was too shallow. Despite this act of humanity, de la Penne spent the next 3 years in various POW camps. His crew partner Antonio Marseglia never made it back, presumed killed during the initial approach. The death rate for these operations was staggering, with almost every mission resulting in the loss of most participants. But this wasn't the only case. In December 1941, in what became known as the Raid on Alexandria, 3 Italian human torpedoes infiltrated the heavily defended British naval base. The operation was meticulously planned, with the torpedoes launched from an Italian submarine about 1.5 miles from the harbor entrance. All 6 men knew they probably wouldn't survive. Lieutenant Vincenzo Martellata and his navigator Marino successfully reached the British tanker Sagona. After attaching their warhead to the ship's hull, they attempted to escape, but became disoriented in the pitch-black water. Their oxygen nearly depleted, they had to surface inside the harbor surrounded by enemy vessels. They were immediately spotted and captured. The British, now alerted, began dropping depth charges throughout the harbor. Meanwhile, the third team of Captain Antonio Marseglia and Spartaco Shergat somehow continued their mission despite the chaos. They managed to place their charge under the battleship HMS Queen Elizabeth. During their escape attempt, Shergat suffered equipment failure, his rebreather flooding with seawater. Fighting to breathe and nearly drowning, he was forced to surface, where British searchlights immediately spotted him. Rather than surrender, he attempted to swim back to open sea, but was caught after swimming for almost 2 hours in the freezing Mediterranean. Despite the capture of all 6 operators, their mission was wildly successful. The explosions severely damaged 2 battleships, a destroyer and a tanker, neutralizing Britain's heavy naval presence in the Mediterranean for months. But the human cost was extreme. Of the 22 men who participated in the next 4 missions that followed, 18 never returned. If you think surviving a depth charge attack while riding a torpedo was the pinnacle of human torpedo pilot miracles, think again. When Captain Ernesto Notari led a 2-torpedo mission against Allied shipping in Gibraltar Harbor on May 8, 1943, it was a catastrophic failure from the start. One of the torpedoes immediately malfunctioned, forcing its crew to abort. But Notari and his navigator Renato Farini continued the mission alone. They successfully navigated past the anti-submarine nets by cutting through them with specialized tools, a painstaking process that took over 2 hours in the dark, freezing water. Just as they approached their target, disaster struck as their oxygen system failed. With no backup and at least 45 minutes from any possible exit point, both men faced certain drowning. In desperation, Notari made an impossible decision. He increased their depth to 30 feet, deliberately flooding their compartment enough to create an air pocket. Taking turns breathing from this shrinking bubble, they abandoned the torpedo and began swimming blindly toward what they hoped was the harbor exit. After nearly an hour underwater with almost no air, they somehow reached the outer harbor where they could surface unseen. The 2 spent the next 3 days hiding along the Spanish coastline, suffering from decompression sickness and hypothermia, before being picked up by a sympathetic fishing boat. Against all odds, they were the only human torpedo crew from their unit to survive the war. When interrogated later about how they had survived the impossible situation, Notari simply said, "We were not ready to die that day." Looking at the statistics, the grim reality of human torpedo operations becomes clear. The Italians deployed a total of 17 attack missions using human torpedoes, losing 84 operators while sinking or severely damaging 28 Allied vessels, totaling over 190,000 tons. The Japanese followed with their Kaiten program, essentially a suicide weapon where the pilot was sealed inside a modified torpedo with no possibility of escape. Of 145 Kaiten pilots deployed, not a single one survived. The British and Germans developed their own versions as the war progressed. The British X-craft midget submarines were slightly less deadly for their crews, but still had casualty rates exceeding 65%. The German Neger and Marder pilots fared even worse, with some estimates suggesting 98% casualty rates for certain missions. These weapons represented both the desperation and innovation that emerge in warfare when conventional means fail. They were terrifyingly effective considering their cost and simplicity. Yet the human toll was almost beyond comprehension. For every 100 men who climbed aboard these weapons, 96 never returned. The human torpedo's legacy isn't just one of sacrifice and courage, but also one of technological evolution. Today's special operations combat swimmers and underwater delivery vehicles can trace their development directly back to these crude but effective weapons. The difference is that modern systems are designed with operator survival as a priority, not as an afterthought. If you want to find out more about these desperate naval weapons and the brave men who operated them, help us out with subscribing and check out our video on the Japanese kamikaze submarines right here.